Hello, and welcome to a book or two to review 16. And today's book we're going to be looking at is Carrier. A century of first-hand accounts of naval operations in War and Peace, edited by Jean Hood. An appropriately naval name. Now, this is an absolutely lovely book. It was published in 2010, so it's 12 years old. It has got pictures in it, so that's nice. And it's got a couple of inserts like that. But more importantly, it is a collection of very cool first-hand accounts. This is the sort of book I give to Jamie Cedar of Armoured Carriers, and happily lose him for about 6 hours going. So let's read a couple of the excerpts out. Admiral Ian Easton, then a pilot in 803 Squadron, HMS Ark Royal. The first operations we carried out once we joined Force H was the attack on the French at Mers el-Kabir. This was a singularly horrific operation. Of course, we didn't know too much about the political and strategic background to it. I don't think that there's any doubt that the generality of feeling was one of considerable sickness that we found ourselves in this position. But of course, initially we didn't expect the French to do anything but accept one or other of our terms, because the terms were very generous. I mean, they were that they could either sail the whole of the fleet to Martinique or Guadeloupe and be interned there for the war in French territory, or they could join us, which seemed to us to be the sensible answer. Or they could sink their ships where they were, and if they weren't prepared to accept any of these alternatives, then we would have to open fire on them. Terms of the ultimatum were taken in by our captain, who had been a naval attaché in Paris just before he joined us as captain of the Ark Royal, and we waited for a very long time, past the time when the ultimatum had expired, and we went on waiting. After a while, we sowed magnetic mines in the entrance to the harbour, and very shortly after that, if I remember rightly, the French cruiser Strasbourg, with 2 destroyers, broke clear of the port. If I remember rightly, one of the destroyers went ahead and blew up on a magnetic mine. She, Strasbourg, followed in the path and got through. We detached Renown or Repulse, one of our faster battlecruisers, to try to bring her action, but although it pursued it to east for a considerable time, it was unsuccessful, and we then opened fire. I was flying a skewer on fighter patrol over the fleet at the time. We were ordered into Iran to protect some swordfish we sent in to do some torpedo bombing. It was a very sickening sight to see those huge chunks of jetty going up in the air, and vast explosions of flame leaping out of the French ships. Our allies of the morning before. Anyway, I got a Dewantain on my tail, a French Dewantain that attacked me, but either his gun jammed or he didn't open the fire, because although I couldn't get him off my tail, we weren't hit. We came from that to Gibraltar, and it was a day or two later we went in again and we sank the Dunkirk. The Dunkirk had been damaged, but she hadn't been sunk. She was still okay. She was attacked by torpedo bombers and torpedoed. We simply provided fighter protection for the swordfish. There was a rather sickening episode in the second attack on Mers el-Kabir when the Dunkirk was torpedoed because one of the torpedoes hit a Liberty boat which was approaching Dunkirk, and a very large number of French seamen were in the water, and one of our swordfish pilots in the mess after the attack was boasting that he had machine gunned the French sailors in the water. I was very pro-French at the time, and I remember having a flaming row with him. It wasn't just I think that everyone in the mess was disgusted with him, and he very quickly realised this was not a boast he better persist in, because people were on the whole very sickened by it. He was a short service entry in the Fleet Air Arm. He had in fact been flying for Franco during the Spanish Civil War. He was a very buccaneer type chap. He was a very good pilot. He was a brave man, I think, but he had a very big gap in his moral armament. We came back to England, and 803 equipped with Fulmars, and we then joined HMS Formidable. And Formidable was part of the fleet that went down to West Africa to try and take Dakar. It doesn't just have pilots, though. It has observers, it has fitters. It has Commander Alan Swinton, who took part in the attack on Bismarck. It's a cool book. It's a very cool book. I had to admit, with the last sort of piece of history, you do realise that the Mirza Kabir had to be more than one attack. You blocked in a fleet and then you made sure you'd sunk it, which also shows you the issue with Taranto. In that the Royal Navy, because it was a single carrier attack, there's only so much you could do. This was a strike carrier of Mirza Kabir, and there's only so much it can do in one strike. Because really, to make things solid, you need a multi-carrier force at a time. The aircraft don't carry the firepower otherwise. Which is why the Royal Navy had been practicing multi-carrier operations for the last 10 years when it entered World War II, at which point it promptly has to have so many different operations going on around the world, it can only ever usually get one carrier per op. Oh, it's just the joy. And then the multi-carrier ops, which again I never thought about really as being multi-carrier operations, but they are the big Mediterranean convoys. They get multiple carriers. Even before when you sort of see some of the stories, you go, yes, the British learned how to operate multiple aircraft carriers together off the Americans when they joined the British Pacific Fleet. They formed the British Pacific Fleet. And you sit there and go, but they had multi-carrier operations going on in the Indian Ocean, and they had multi-carrier operations going on in Mediterranean convoys. They even had a multi-carrier operation at one point going on off the coast of Norway. These were all a long time before they learned anything. They learned anything from the Americans in the Pacific. Admittedly, they did learn. This is not to say they didn't learn anything from the Americans. They learned a lot from the Americans and American experience in the Pacific. You're going to. But they don't learn how to do it. They learn better ways, and in some ways improvements on their ways of doing it. But in other ways, the Americans try and teach them things, and they go, but that doesn't work there like that if we do it this way because of our experience. And the Americans would go, ooh, and we'll borrow our ideas. And that doesn't demean even Navy. Guess what? You have two large bodies of professional, experienced personnel who are going through a lot of high-intensity war operations. They're going to come up with some good ideas. And sometimes it's going to be a Brit, sometimes it's going to be a Yank, and it doesn't matter. Sometimes it's going to be an Australian or a Canadian or who knows who on the Allied side. It doesn't matter. What matters is, are they then implemented? And in what form are they implemented? Are they adapted for each Navy? Because each Navy still maintains their own culture and style of operations, which are slightly different. Yes, the British Pacific Fleet operates alongside the Americans. At no point, though, would anyone consider the British Pacific Fleet were operating American style. And yes, at times American carriers, American ships are operating alongside British forces. At no point are they operating it British style. And that is fine. CPO Richard Griffin, RN 815, the squadron, HMS Illustrious. And this is from MaritimeQuest.com, apparently. In January 1941, we embarked on the carrier for what was to be the last time I was on board. As always, we read orders of the day. There was a message from the CNC commenting that units of the German Air Force had been sent to airfields in Sicily. We might expect rather more activity than Heathrow. We arrived off Pantera. Things started hot up, and the ship's tannoy system kept us informed of events as they unfolded. I would presume he would have said things started to heat up, but Maybe he did say hot up, I haven't checked the primary source. The cruiser Bonaventure engaged enemy units to the westward. The destroyer Gallant stuck a mine and her bows were blown off. I remember standing in the well deck as the grey sea surging past. There seemed to be an eerie, still air over the ship. I've often thought about that since. Fear? Premonition? I know I had a very strange feeling. Suddenly the fleet came under heavy air attack, mainly directed illustrious by squadrons of Stuka dive bombers. All the guns of the fleet opened fire. 2 seaplanes launched the torpedo attack. A diversionary feint. The tannoy told us that large numbers of aircraft were in the area of Sicily. The ship was all closed up at action stations, and then all the ship's guns opened up. The steel box of the hangar was like a huge sound box. My action station, as with all Mountain's crews, was in the hangar with the aircraft, which, by the way, were all heavily armed and loaded with torpedoes ready for an attack on the Italian fleet. Illustrious was armed with 16 4.5 dual-purpose guns and 8 6-barreled 2-pounder quick-firing AA weapons. The ship kept jumping and shaking. Several large bombs hit the ship aft, and the after hangar was on fire. The noise was indescribable. In my baptism of fire, all that sticks in my mind are impressions. I was standing more or less in the centre of the hangar. A chap came down from the flight deck. His rubber suit was full of holes with blood leaking through them. I helped carry him down to the casualty station in the washroom flats. Surgeons were busy. Blood was washed from side to side with the sway of the ship. I returned to my action station in the hangar. The ship continued to rock and sway. I looked up with fear and apprehension. There was an almighty flash as a 1,000-pound bomb pierced the 4-inch armoured deck and exploded. I was only aware of a great wind and bits of aircraft debris all blowing out to the forward lift shaft of 300 tons, which was also blown out. There was dead and wounded all around. My overalls were blown off, and I had small wounds to the back of my head and shoulder. I was probably 10-15 feet away from the bomb when it exploded. Lucky I survived? I prefer the thought of someone looking out for me. The hangar by then was burning all over. The ship's commander came and said, "Come on, lads, close the armour doors." The overhead sprays then flooded the hangar. The ship started to sink by the stern, and everyone had to blow up lifebelts. Then came a spot of humour in all that chaos. Poor old Corporal Gatter came through a side door, white sheet, saying, "I wish I hadn't bloody joined." The battering carried on for 6 to 7 hours. There were many wounded piled up. The aft surgeon station had been destroyed, and the forward station was unable to cope quickly with so many casualties. Captain Boyd finally steered with engines into Malta. The ship was quiet at last. Next morning we cleared lower deck, and roll call was taken. Announcement on the tannoy ordered in case of further attacks on the ships, all hands, other than gun crews, should go over the side and into the big caves in the hillside. No sooner said than over the enemy came, so over the side we went. That same day, all air maintenance ratings were dispersed. The surviving 815 and 819 squadron people shipped on the cruiser Orion back to Alexandria, there to reform as 815, and where we operated an RAF command for the next 2 years. There were 3 aircraft in the air when Illustrious was damaged, but there were some spares at Dakalia. Some were sent from the UK, and we were soon fully operational. My last memory of Illustrious was clearing lower deck and lining the ship's side to pay a last salute to the destroyer carrying our dead to sea for burial. Lines of white ensigns lay row upon row. The crew were at attention as we were. Words are still inadequate. This is not just a book about World War II. It's got operations coming right the way through to, well, Send a Carrier, 1993 to 2010. It's the last chapter. It's a good book, full of personal accounts which are rich in context and in detail. Interesting question for everyone, and this is the question I often pose my students. If Article 5 of the 1936 London Naval Treaty was not 23,000 tons standard displacement, but was 25 or 26,000 tons, which were arguably considered. I think there was one even a suggestion which was a request for 27,000 tons. you could have still built an armoured carrier, but the air group would have gone up dramatically from 36 to more than likely 48, or maybe even as many as 54, in terms of the 1939-1940 air group, which were generally smaller aircraft than that would be carried later in the war. Considering the success of the armoured carriers, and considering the capabilities of them, a slightly larger air group, probably more firepower, because knowing the British, they could conceivably have put in four more double 4.5s. They might not have. What would have been the results? Because you read these accounts, you realize how tough these ships are. You consider the British and the American doctrine of air defense, especially as it comes on. You consider the disruption that fighters can cause. You carry more spare parts and you carry more aircraft. Because let's be honest, an air group of 48. What are they probably carrying? One of the theories I've put forward, and I've often considered it most practical, is that they would still maintain the 24 Swordfish, but they would have probably been fitted with 12 skewers and 12 Fulmars. That would have been their air group. 12 scout fighter dive bombers and 12 reconnaissance fighters, as they were considered at the time. Now, admittedly, neither the Fulmar nor the Skewer is the world's best fighter. I'm not going to stand up and claim they were, but you have more of those aircraft. You have a stronger air defense. Or perhaps you have 24 Fulmars and 24 Swordfish. Again, quite possible. Then you definitely have more fighters. If it got to 54, who knows what that would be, but this is not really what-if history. This is the point at which you start to understand the decisions made. Because the British and the Americans both have the same limits of weights. But the Americans are thinking, we have a maneuver. We have space to maneuver. We have the Pacific to fight in. And so we can afford to use speed and maneuverability as our armor. And hopefully, with enough industrial power, we will maintain air capacity so we can concentrate on a big strike. The British are also considering fighting in the Pacific. But the trouble is, that's the other side of the world from their industrial base. So anything which gets damaged there is going to have to go home. A long way. Which means it might as well be out of the war. It gets damaged, it's got to go all the way home. It's not going to be back for months. It's as good as out the war. It's as good as sunk. And they also have to fight in the Mediterranean, where you do not have space to maneuver. You can use speed, but you don't really have space to maneuver. And planes are pretty soon covering that distance quite capitally. So then that changes your ideas. You start to think, well, we've got to build these ships tough to make them survive. It becomes down to a similar doctrine of battlecruiser and battleship. Battlecruisers are excellent ships for fighting in the Atlantic and fighting in the Pacific and the Indian Ocean. There is a reason the Italian Navy, one of the world's premier dreadnought navies, builds fast battleships, doesn't think about building a battlecruiser. Because, in the nicest way, there are choke points, very nicely positioned at several points, which are several points through the Mediterranean, which you're going to have to fight through. It's the same for the Austro-Hungarians. So it comes down to you have an armored carrier. But the point is this. If rather than 23,000 tons as your limit, you have a limit of 24, 25, probably at least 25, but maybe 27,000 tons, which was considered and was actually theoretically nowhere near the deep load weight of the HMS Ark Royal, which was 28,000 tons. If you had got that much more tonnage, you would have probably had a slightly longer ship, probably not much wider, but slightly longer. Might have gone for an 8 boiler, 4 steam turbines, 4 shaft arrangement. So, to an extent, as even more powerful than it was, but might have kept the 6 boilers and 3 shafts and 3 turbines, 3 shaft arrangements. After all, that's worked well with Ark Royal, and 111,000 shaft horsepower, so they're pretty powerful. But I think they would have been a bit longer, and I think honestly, you end up very quickly, if you consider how quickly it is they are built. You end up with Implacable class, or something approaching Implacable class, which were not that far off those figures. They were 32,000 tons in deep load, and not far off, I think it was 27,000 tons in standard. Now, they're upgraded, they are powerful, they're good ships, and originally they are designed, actually, of course, to be 23,000 tons, but things get added on as they grow. As the world changes, they change with it. But that's the point is, the Implacable class, well, they carried a lot more aircraft. You could have very easily got there a bit earlier with a little bit more tonnage, and that would have changed World War II dramatically. But it gets back to the point. The Royal Navy is building ships which are tough, because if you consider the American equivalent to it, Indefatigable and Implacable carries even more aircraft because they don't have it. They don't have the armor. And it's only when you start to get the midways, which are sort of the Americans going, with us getting closer to Japan, suddenly we haven't got the space to maneuver. And I would argue that's what the midways are about. The Americans thinking, we haven't got the space to maneuver, and we want more survivable design, so we're going for this. And I would argue the Malta class, which are, of course, the ones which would follow on the Audacious. So really, the Audacious and the Malta class, to an extent, are the British going, We really want the American Air Group, but we can't afford to lose the survivability of our ships. So they come together in the end because it's quite straightforward. You need an air group. The more aircraft you can carry, the better your individual aircraft carrier is going to be. But there are also large chunks of the world where you need your aircraft carrier to be survivable in order to operate in it, because you're not going to be operating in what's considered a permissive environment. So expect this debate to start appearing again, because there have been a few people recently pointing out various carriers are slightly light on aircraft for their size. Well, the aircraft they carry are much bigger. And as I've often said, the thing that's fixed on an aircraft carrier is the space of its hangar and its flight deck, unless you want to do massive work. The thing that changes is the size of aircraft carried. The other thing that changes is perhaps our capacity to build carriers rapidly, in which case perhaps making the individual carriers more survivable makes sense again. But that's well off topic. Very good book. Enjoy.